With the release of Genshin Impact 4.0, Fontaine is finally open for business, and it took me about 2 weeks to clear out the main story, mostly because I was busy with other things. All I have to say so far is that Fontaine is incredibly beautiful. The layout of the cities, the vast bodies of water, even the French European inspired design of its people and buildings. I'm so far very much invested in Fontaine as a location, despite my initial apprehensions of underwater based gameplay. But this is a channel mostly covering lore, and of course, we're gonna focus mostly on that. So to kick off the first Genshin Impact Fontaine video on this channel, let's start with a theory that was in the back of my mind throughout my playthrough. A theory that isn't about focalors, but rather the Dragon of Hydro. Before we dive into that, if you want to see more Genshin Impact content, do consider subscribing to the channel. Now, fair warning, like most lore-based videos, this will be both long and full of spoilers. So if you haven't played through Fontaine's storyline, then you might want to come back a bit later. Not only because of spoilers, but also that a lot of what I'll bring up will cover things brought up throughout the story, and you might have a better appreciation of it once you've completed the entire thing. If you still want to watch this video, obviously I won't stop you, but consider this your spoiler warning. Basically, I have the suspicion that beneath Fontaine's courthouse is one of the 7 sovereigns, the Dragon of Hydro. But let's take a step back and let me establish the necessary clues and hints of why I think this is the case. The very first mention of the Hydro Dragon is actually through a legend told to us by Furina, one of Lini's siblings. When we first meet him, there was a sudden shift in weather from being sunny to suddenly raining. It was odd enough that Paimon had to point it out, and Furina shared a legend he heard when he was still a child in Fontaine. Long ago, the Hydro Dragon was said to reside within the borders of Fontaine. While they are not sure where it went as of present day, it was said that each time it weeps, the skies would cloud up and rain would fall upon the region. And so children in Fontaine would often be told that if they want to go outside and play, they should shout to the skies and implore the Hydro Dragon to not cry. It's an innocent enough folktale that was likely just a convenient way for parents to explain the weather to their children. But being a lore channel, obviously I would read too much into this. Lini also mentions in the same conversation that the rain seems to always appear whenever there is a court case or a trial happening. This again is brushed off as being normal and just mere coincidence, especially to those who reside in Fontaine where this occurs consistently. Now later on, when the traveler eventually reaches the Opera Epiclese, the main location where trials take place, or the courthouse, we are shown the Fountain of Lucine, a point in Fontaine where all its waters converge. The story then progresses, we see Lini's magic show, and we are eventually thrust into Lini's trial as he is accused of a crime. It is here that we learn 2 things. The first is how the court proceedings in Fontaine work. Essentially, all you need to know is that after evidence is provided and the prosecution and defense argue their positions, the Chief Justice will provide his opinion, and every fact, consideration, emotion, and idea is fed into a machine called the Oratrice Mécanique d'Analyse Cardinale. Functionally, it's a supercomputer said to have sentience, built supposedly by the Hydro Archon to pass judgment during court proceedings. Throughout Lini's magic show, we learn in his court case that his ultimate goal was to actually figure out how the Oratrice worked, as the people he worked for suspected it functions using the power of the Hydroneosis. However, as he got closer to the location where the Oratrice core is kept, he heard an unidentified and unfamiliar voice, which caused him to turn back. That's pretty much as far as he got. Now I know by this point I haven't really talked about the Hydro Dragon I mentioned earlier, but just stay with me as there is a lot of setup that needs to be done for this idea to make sense. The next piece of this puzzle is the Chief Justice himself, Novelet, and there's a few things about him that makes him rather suspicious and lightly tied to this whole theory. Firstly, during Navia's meeting with him, she points out that he is practically emotionless and only feigns typical or expected emotions when talking to others. Novelet also sort of hints that he isn't human because in a later scene, Novelet says to himself that he doesn't understand humans and the decisions behind their actions. Finally, Novelet has rather unique eyes that are reminiscent of Orobashi's avatar we meet in Enkanomiya, again hinting that he might not be fully human. Now, what does all of this have to do with the Hydro Dragon? Well, based on the points I've described here, it may be an indication that the Hydro Dragon is still indeed in Fontaine, only that it may be imprisoned beneath the Opera Epiclese. It's also likely to have something to do with how the Oratrice works. It can't be a coincidence that the legend of rain in Fontaine being caused by the Hydro Dragon weeping also seems to coincide with the fact that rain typically falls whenever there is a court case, which also happens to be the only time the Oratrice is ever in use. Even more so, the Fountain of Lucine, which I'll remind you is the convergence point of all water in Fontaine, is located literally in front of the building where the Oratrice is housed. It seems that whatever that's hidden here seems to form a pretty strong connection between the weather patterns, the Oratrice, and the central point of all water in Fontaine. So then, where does Novelet fit into this whole thing since I brought him up earlier? Well, Novelet could be someone who was created or is an avatar of the Hydro Dragon itself given his appearance and hints of him not being fully human. If the dragon is really imprisoned here, perhaps Novelet was created to find a way to free the dragon, similar to the Orobashi's avatar, who was created for a different purpose, as well as Apep's creations. Now, a completely alternative idea is the possibility that Novelet himself is the Hydro Dragon. As I've mentioned, he's hinted to not be human, has a rather unique appearance, and to add to that, he's seen to be using what appears to be hydro powers, but we haven't seen a hint of a vision on him. He's also present each time the court is in session and when the Oratrice is in use, plus each time that it has rained, Novelet is almost always somewhere in the background or in court. But since this talks more about Novelet specifically, I'll expand on the possibility of this idea in another video. Going back to the original idea, a Hydro Dragon being kept here against its will also ties together with the prophecy that we've heard of so much throughout the main story. You know, the one about water levels rising and washing the sins of the Fontaine people. The very same prophecy that Novelet himself confirms comes from the first Hydro Archon. But hold on, I hear you say. Now you're saying the prophecy can also accommodate this dragon being here, so clearly I must be overreaching, right? Well, if you recall, when we first met Apep, the Dendro dragon in Sumeru, the reason why Nahida wanted to save it despite its dislike of her is because if Apep were to die, a huge amount of elemental Dendro energy would be released. The effects of this would essentially hyper-accelerate the growth of Sumeru's rainforest and essentially causing a catastrophe that would likely result in the end of Sumeru and perhaps even the surrounding nations. Well, what would you think would happen if a Hydro Dragon on the level of the 7 Sovereigns, similar to Apep, dies and releases a huge amount of Hydro energy? Perhaps the water levels would increase, as mentioned in the prophecy. Now, if this isn't compelling enough, or maybe the right word is confusing, let me throw one more thing into this theory, the Oceanids. After meeting Idilla, and even from past lore, we know that the Oceanids left Fontaine on the instructions of the first Hydro Archon. I talked about this topic in more detail in another video, but Idilla essentially mentions that after they left, and after the second Hydro Archon took power, the Oceanids didn't acknowledge her position and chose to not return. She also mentions that it had something to do with the waters of Fontaine changing and becoming filled with anger and hate. So what if the Oceanids are similar to the beings created by Apep? The beings that took on the form of fungi in Sumeru in an attempt to save their dragon, or according to them, their home. Trapping and using the Hydro Dragon could be something that focalors did, and something that the first Hydro Archon knew about and disagreed with. Maybe after the Hydro Dragon was imprisoned, the Oceanids, who I'm implying here originates from the dragon itself, disagreed with this decision and chose to not acknowledge focalors as the second Hydro Archon. To bring all of this X-Files level conspiracy to a close, I'll mention one last thing. Once you've completed the main story, if you go back to the Lucine Fountain, there is a voice that can be heard weeping. It mentions that its condition has been interminable and it's very lonely, as well as questioning how much longer it must endure its fate. This sounds to me like someone or something has been imprisoned, and again makes me think this is where the Hydro Dragon is being kept and used to power the Orochis. Now all of this is again just a huge guess. There is no specific evidence that the dragon is even here, and it could be someone else entirely being used as the core of the Orochis. We don't even know how the Orochis really functions, so much of this could be just wrong when we learn of the truth in the future. The core of the Orochis could just be the Hydroneosis. Perhaps the first Hydro Archon is still alive and imprisoned, or maybe it's something to do with focalors herself, as she does seem to have several personalities. Any of these might end up becoming the truth, or maybe none of them will, but the point is we don't know what exactly is going on with the Orochis or what secret Fontaine is keeping from us. It's just a suspicion I have given the things we learned in the story, and for now I just happen to think it's the dragon that's being kept here against its will. Now I've enjoyed writing this story out immensely, and whichever way the story decides to diverge in the future, I wholeheartedly am looking forward to learn about it. Let me know in the comments if you have an alternative thought or idea with whatever that's going on here. If you've stayed this long, I really appreciate you taking the time and watching this video, and if you've enjoyed it, do consider liking and subscribing to the channel. I'll see you in the next one, and as usual, have a nice day.